So today we're going to be continuing with Chapter 12, Reconstruction and its Effects. This is Section 2, Reconstructing the South. So what we're going to be looking at here is what kind of changes are brought, what kind of advancements are made, what does the South look like in these years when Reconstruction is being fully enforced, when it is being truly supported, when it has the full weight of the federal government behind it, when it was really kind of in its heyday, in its prime, when it was really, in action, in full effect. What kind of changes were actually brought to the South. Keeping in mind, just to kind of recap what we talked about last time, we had that first initial short-lived presidential version of Reconstruction led by President Johnson, which didn't change hardly anything. The same people in power, African Americans in a situation that really wasn't all that different from slavery, and then that was soon thrown out by Congress in favor of what we call radical Reconstruction, or we also call that Congressional Reconstruction. Sometimes we even call that military Reconstruction, because it was being implemented or at least enforced by the military. And according to that Military Reconstruction Act, the South was basically being forced to change. They're putting in the military to say you have to do these things, including they cannot allow ex-Confederate leaders, those former Southern leaders in charge anymore. They can't allow them to hold office. They can't allow them to vote. And they have to let African American men vote. So what we're going to be looking at here is what kind of changes are they able to make when that is taking place, because they are able to make some pretty extraordinary changes, some things that are really quite remarkable. Many of these things, though, keep in mind, will be temporary, and once Reconstruction is over and nobody's making the South do all this stuff anymore, they'll find ways to go back to kind of how things were. But let's start by just reminding ourselves of what exactly needs to be reconstructed. We're going to move through this pretty quickly because by this time, this has pretty much been established. We've talked a couple of times by now about what kind of condition the South was in and what all really needed to be constructed at this point. So we know that the South was in shambles following the war. If you think back to our study of the Civil War, we know that there are whole cities and towns that have been destroyed, places like Atlanta, places like Richmond, places like Columbia. They have been pretty much burnt to the ground. The image here that you see on your screen right above me, this is Richmond. You can see that it looks like, bombs have just been dropped on it. So millions of dollars of Southern property has been destroyed. Farms have been destroyed, plantations, crops, railroads, bridges, factories, what little there was in the South, a lot of it's been destroyed. People are displaced. There is the psychological effect. The economy, we know, has been totally ruined. Southern or Confederate money is not worth anything. There is no money around that's worth anything. A lot of people had put all their money into either Confederate paper money or war bonds or things that are now completely worthless. So the economy has been just left absolutely destitute. So there is a lot that needs to be revamped, that needs to be renewed, and needs to be, rejuvenated as a result of Reconstruction. So, some of Reconstruction has to do, with that physical rebuilding, but most of that is going to be done by individual states, by individual cities, individual counties. Most of them are going to take care of that kind of stuff. So we're mainly going to look at how they're reconstructing their governments and what that means. So let's talk about those political changes. Here's where we see some remarkably big things taking place, because keep in mind that during Reconstruction, ex-Confederate leaders, which were Democrats. Remember that Democrats was the political party that really had any kind of shot and had all the power in the South prior to the Civil War. Well, those people aren't allowed to vote anymore. Those people aren't allowed to hold office at this point. And who is? African Americans. African Americans are going to overwhelmingly support the Republican Party. Remember that the Republican Party would have never had a shot, could have never seen the light of day in the South prior to the Civil War. Think back to that election of 1860. We talked about how the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, wasn't even on the ballot in Southern states because they wouldn't even hear of that, because white Southerners saw the Republican Party as anti-slavery, as hostile to the South. They wouldn't hear of it. But now, those white Southern Democrats cannot hold power. African Americans can. And they are largely going to support the Republican Party, of course, which they view as the party of emancipation and the party that wants to help them, the party that wants to see them have rights, which they did. So this means, essentially, you can put it as simply as during Reconstruction, white Southern Democrats out, Republicans in. And so Republican governments are going to take control all over the South at the local level, at the state level. Republicans are going to dominate Republican state governments. There are more than 600 African Americans that are elected to state government offices, and they are going to start imposing reforms on the South based on Republican principles. We tend to think of Republicans because at this point, because we mostly talked about them as being the anti-slavery party and the party of abolition and the party of free soil and all that kind of thing. But we need to remember that this was a national party that had interest in a lot of things. Overall, Republicans supported economic development. They supported factories, and they supported westward expansion and internal improvements, and those things to encourage the economy to grow. So that's what their goals are, as well as seeing African Americans gain more rights. They want to see the South modernized. They want to see their economy revamped. They want to see their economy more resemble the North, and as well as social reforms too. So they're going to be implementing their own program, their own way of doing things throughout the South. One of the first things they're going to do is abolish black codes. That's what I'm covering up there. We talked about those black codes that Southern states are going to pass in the presidential Reconstruction era, when Republican governments, many of which are led by African Americans, or at least include African Americans, they are going to get rid of those things and start including African Americans in the political process far more than they ever have been before. As far as those new programs, we're going to see all kinds of public works projects, building new roads, building bridges, building dams, building railroads, other kinds of things for public works, whether it be for sanitation or transportation or different things like that. Stuff that a lot of northern cities and states had invested in long before and continued to invest in, but things that southern states had not done, either because they didn't think they needed it, they didn't want it, and most certainly because they didn't want to pay for it. So we'll start to see a lot of that stuff improved, and a lot more of that kind of building and stuff like that going on during the Reconstruction years, when Republicans who wanted that kind of stuff were in charge to actually implement those changes. Big changes in the social structure. They're going to be establishing mental hospitals, orphanages, improvements to their prison system, and public schooling is something that will be forever transformed in the South as a result of Reconstruction. We've talked about these social things, particularly mental institutions, prisons, and public schools. Those were things that the South had also very much lagged behind on it because, one, it was so rural, but they also didn't want to pay for it, and they certainly didn't want to educate African Americans or poor white people. And while we'll see later, while a lot of the changes made during Reconstruction end up being temporary, and once Reconstruction is over, they'll get rid of it or change it back. But these are some of the things that do end up lasting. The changes to the public school system end up being something that the South never reverses. So it is forever changed as a result of Reconstruction. So these are some of the things, whereas we can question a lot of things about Reconstruction and whether or not they were successful or whether or not they were a failure. Public schools and some of those other social reforms are a way that we can see where Reconstruction did have some lasting effects. Now, this also means that this has got to be paid for somehow. I mentioned that one of the reasons that Southerners had stood against these things for so long is because they didn't want to pay for it, and that is the reality, is to have these kind of things, the money's got to come from somewhere, so you'd have to include that as part of those Republican reforms. Taxes were raised, and so there were a lot of higher taxes on property in the South, which a lot of people didn't like. That did lead to a lot of debt in some states. It did lead, and there was some, not necessarily because they were who they were, but there was some mismanagement. There was some, poor decisions that were made with money and budgets and things like that, that led to a lot of debt and led to some financial problems in some states, which is one of the reasons that we'll see in the next section. We eventually get a lot of people angry over Reconstruction and thinking that it has all just been a bunch of corruption and there's been too much bad that came along with it. So just keep that in mind, that there's a lot of people that not only don't like the stuff that's being done, but don't like the financial policies that it requires. They don't like the new taxes and stuff like that. Next, I want to take a look at African Americans during Reconstruction, because certainly African Americans are going to experience dramatic changes in the Reconstruction era, mainly because, slavery is over. But in the radical Reconstruction era, in the congressional Reconstruction era, as we talked about, radical Republicans, part of their Reconstruction program was to see African Americans more than just free, but to see them as fully participating members of society, to see them them included in all of the promises, included in all of the benefits of citizenship and all that kind of thing. So we want to talk about what that looked like. Remember that the 15th Amendment, the third of the Reconstruction Amendments, meant that African American men could now vote. And in the Reconstruction era, you had the full weight and the full force of the federal government to make sure that southern states were doing that. And so now you have, in some states, as high as 90% of African American men becoming active voters. Many of these people were slaves just a few years before. So that's pretty darn remarkable, that during this time you did have this huge increase in the electorate of African Americans being able to vote that were not even considered legal citizens a few years before. That's pretty amazing. And also, those of you that know a little bit more about U.S. history will know that once Reconstruction is over, this is something we won't see again for a long time, that African American voting goes to basically nothing in the South once Reconstruction ends. And it will be like that until the Civil Rights Movement. This is one of the things that the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s attempted and eventually successfully corrected to an extent. So that's a pretty, one of the big ways where Reconstruction is this very, very unique, albeit very short time period in which we see some really remarkable things happening. But African Americans are not just voting. African Americans are actually being elected to political office, being elected to city councils, being elected to state legislatures, and even being elected to the national government. There were, I believe, at some point 16 African Americans that were elected to Congress from southern states. We're not talking about African Americans being elected from places like New York and Illinois and places where slavery didn't exist. There were some. But we're talking from places like Mississippi had an African-American senator. That's pretty incredible. One state, I'm wanting to say Louisiana, had an African-American governor. There, I believe it was South Carolina at some point, the majority of their state legislature was African-American. And this was not, 1970. This was 1870 that this was going on. So it's pretty amazing that it's able to happen during the Reconstruction era. Meaning that African Americans are getting a voice in the government that had considered them property until just a few years before this. Now, we probably want to think that most African Americans move to the north. They get jobs in factories. They get education. For most of them, while there are a lot voting, and yes, you do have some that are able to get elected to office and all that sort of a thing, they are an exception, not the rule. Most African Americans are going to stay in the South, although some will move north. And for many of them, they will actually, although they may have more rights and not be legally property, for many of them, they will end up doing what they've always done. Their opportunities, and this is true of poor white Southerners as well, their opportunities still end up being rather limited in a lot of other ways. Other ways, though, that African Americans were able to experience freedom, enjoy freedom, ways they were able to just sort of be their own people. They are able to reunite with families. They are able to get married. They are able to just make their own decisions about where they go, where they live, who they associate with, the clothes that they wear, the names that they have, even adopting their own new last names or new first names, trying to give themselves something that they didn't have under the days of slavery, just their own identity, control over their own body, control over their own path in life. We tend to take those things for granted, but those are things that African Americans at this point in time, of course, pursued, and relished. They're able to establish their own churches, their own social organizations, their own clubs, their own charity groups. Religion had, of course, been a part of African American culture and slave culture for a long time, but now they're actually able to start their own congregations, be leaders in their own churches. Before, they had been encouraged, but had to worship alongside their white masters. And now they're able to form their own denominations, things like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and take on leadership roles and roles of power and decision making in a way that they hadn't been able to do. And religion will continue to be an important part of that community. Now, let's talk about the idea of land and the concept of land. I mentioned earlier, I think in the previous section, that African Americans realized that their kind of best hope for true success, for more than just freedom, but real independence and economic stability, was education and land. Most people realize that unless they get their own land to farm, their own land to call their own, and to make profit from, then they will forever be at the mercy of someone else. They'll forever be, reporting to somebody else, underneath somebody else. So there was great hope amongst African Americans, and it was part of that very, very lofty vision of Reconstruction that land would be distributed to African Americans, that there would be some kind of a land distribution program that, as punishment for slavery and as punishment for treason, that land would be taken, would be confiscated from that old wealthy planter elite class and doled out to African Americans, given to them. In fact, there was some of you may have heard the phrase 40 acres and a mule. The whole 40 acres and a mule idea came from General Sherman, the guy that terrorized Atlanta. He gave a speech or made this proclamation about how we're going to take all this land from these former slave owners and give all slaves or families 40 acres of it and a mule to help them farm it. So that was kind of a suggestion. It does not ever happen. So this does not become a thing. It fails to happen because the whole concept of land confiscation, of taking somebody's private property and giving it to somebody else, was just too much for most people to swallow, even for a lot of radical Republicans. And it just kind of flew in the face of the whole notion of private property, which the Constitution supposedly protects and stuff like that. So that fails to ever be approved. And so unfortunately for most freed people, land of their own ends up being something that's still quite elusive. A few may be able to acquire land of their own, but most of them won't. And just as they had to live on someone else's land as a slave, they will also have to be and be beholden to that slave owner. For most of them, even after slavery, that's still the case. They are living on somebody else's land and reporting to somebody else and kind of at the mercy of somebody else. So we'll get to that part of it in just a moment. Let's take a look at the Southern economy and the changes that are brought to it during the Reconstruction era. Like most things in Reconstruction, you have this kind of big, lofty goal, this grand vision of what we want to happen, and then what actually happens, which ends up being a lot less than that. It's sort of an expectation versus reality kind of thing. We see those memes all the time. So there was this vision of a fully transformed South, and it got this name, the New South, this concept of the New South, that everything before the Civil War is the Old South, and the post-Civil War South is this New South. And this vision of a New South, which was, shared by a lot of radical Republicans and other people, was this vision of a more modern South, a South that more looked like the North, a South certainly without slavery, with industry, with factories, with roads, with railroads, with shipping, with more towns, with more paid labor, with more of a middle class. Again, a more modernized, more northern looking South, that they were going to completely transform it and bring it, out of that old, completely based on agricultural kind of a phase. As we've already kind of mentioned, in reality, this ends up being extremely limited. There are some changes to that effect. The South does industrialize more as a result of all these changes. There is certainly more industry in the South as a result of Reconstruction, but it is still only a tiny, tiny bit. And we can still see evidence of that even today. I mean, even today, Southern states are still more agriculture than anything. I mean, certainly there are tons more businesses and stores, industry, more of that has come to the South in the past 30, 40 years, but it is still more agriculture than anything else. It's still the number one thing in Alabama for sure. I think about 40% of the economy is made from agriculture. It's certainly a different kind of agriculture, but agriculture nonetheless. So for the South, it does remain not entirely agriculture, but mostly agricultural, but perhaps less dependent on cotton. After a time, that agriculture does become more diversified, and certainly there is no more slavery, but there is still a labor system that has some similarities to slavery that comes to the South that we're going to look at in just a moment. So the whole concept of the New South is quite limited. Industrialization does not come to the South in this big, massive wave. However, there are some new industries, particularly textile mills. The one industry that does really have a good bit of success and does achieve some kind of dominance in the South after Reconstruction is textiles, cloth. Textile mills, spinning cotton and stuff into thread and all that to make, different kinds of cloth and clothing and stuff like that. And that makes sense because the South, with all the cotton, it kind of made sense that textile mills would take off, right next door. You can still see kind of the skeletons of this nowadays nowadays. Textile industry has pretty much collapsed in the South now, but that's something that's only happened in the past, 30, 40 years. But towns like Valley nearby, towns like Opelika nearby, used to, or at least part of them, were mill towns that were sprung up around these textile mills that started closing as most of that stuff started moving overseas, in the past couple of decades. But let's take a look at the labor system in the South. So there is no more slavery, but in its absence, something called sharecropping develops. So this becomes the commonly used labor practice in the South without slavery, sharecropping. And many former slaves and many poor white Southerners will end up as sharecroppers. And the way this works is sharecroppers, say you have maybe they're a former slave, maybe they're not, someone who's a farmer, because that's what most people were in the South. They don't have money to acquire their own land. There is no land for them to acquire. So what are they going to do? They're going to have to farm somebody else's land, the way that slaves had to do that. So they're unable to gain their own land. So basically a farmer or a landowner is going to kind of like rent them land. They're going to say, okay, you can live here, build your house on my land, these are your fields that you can grow crops from, all that kind of stuff. I'll give you the seeds, I'll give you the tools, all that kind of stuff. And then you'll pay me for that. You'll pay your rent, as it were, not with money, but with a portion of the crop. So that's why it's called sharecropping. They have to share the crop with the landowner. So they are living on someone else's land. They're farming someone else's land, trying to survive. And at the end of the harvest and the end of the season, they've got to share that crop with the landowner. And all there's contracts involved about exactly how much and all that kind of stuff. A share of the crop at harvest time. So this kind of develops kind of because it had to, because there wasn't any money around. So when the war ended, and so people end up as sharecroppers. Now, this is not a situation that is going to make people a whole lot of money, because for most people, when they pay their share, there's nothing left for them. There's nothing left for them to keep. For many of them, there's not even enough to pay the landowner their full share. So they're going to end up giving them everything they've got, and then still owe them another 10 or 20% the next year. And then the year after that, it just becomes a cycle of debt and poverty. It is not something where you're going to make a lot of money and, be really successful and all of that. Most people hoped for that, and a few people are maybe able to get out from under it. But this is a system that's very difficult to get out from under. They're constantly, attached. They're tied to the land, beholden to that landowner, not able to go anywhere, not able to do anything else, poor, in a constant cycle of debt. It's, for some people, you might even compare it in a way to just a different kind of slavery. But this is what most African Americans and what most poor white Southerners end up doing after the Civil War. They go back to doing what they had always done, working the land. We want to think that they all get great jobs and they get education and they get their own property, but for most of them, that just simply was not the case. And this system, as I said, keeps people tied to the land, keeps them in poverty. And this is a system which persists in the South in some places as late as the 1960s. This was still going on. It no longer is practiced in the South, but this is a situation that kept people very, very poor and very, very destitute in the South. Now, some of them might be able to make a little bit of money and eventually become tenant farmers, which means that they are actually paying rent. They're not paying with a portion of the crop. But for most, that cycle of sharecropping is where they will end up. So what we will look at lastly in the final section is the ways that Reconstruction was, ways that it failed, ways that it didn't address certain things, and ways that people started fighting back against it, because obviously a lot of people didn't like these changes, particularly those white Southern Democrats that have been shut out of power. They're not too happy about that, and they will soon start fighting back. And that will eventually lead the country and the national government to say this Reconstruction thing is just not worth it anymore, or we did what we could do and now it's time to move on, and we'll soon see Reconstruction be abandoned and then a lot of these changes be reversed.